Well, again, my name is Scott Sennefeld with Veridus Group. I appreciate you being here. I'm going to read through just kind of the first opening intro here, if you will, and then myself and Leslie Wagner will be presenting, going through the information today. But first of all, thank you all for joining us. If you would, please remember to mute yourself so that we can avoid any background noise as we're going through this. If you have any questions, there's two ways to submit those, if you will. You don't want to forget it, you can write it down or send a message through the Zoom chat. Or you have the option to send it directly to the host or to everyone. Either way is fine. We can address those towards the end. You can also unmute yourself, and we can, when we get to the Q&A portion, and certainly have some open discussion. Last paragraph there is, again, we are not attorneys or financial advisors. So we will not be giving any legal or financial advice in our webinar today. If you feel the need for that type of advice based on any of the information presented, we would encourage you to reach out to your attorney or financial advisor. And if you don't have one, we'd be happy to make recommendations. So again, appreciate you all for being here. With that, we are going to present and talk through site due diligence selection and preparation for future development and avoiding pitfalls. As I mentioned, Leslie Wagner with Genovis, whom we team up with routinely on a number of projects, is joining us here today. So we'll be kind of pitch hitting here and there and jumping in together. And then certainly would love to entertain questions at the end and talk through any specific topics in greater detail. Just a real quick kind of overview of Veridus Group. And some of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with this, so we'll just kind of go through this real quick and talk about Veridus as far as what we do. Construction services and is certainly a big part of what we do. The owner's technical rep side of the business, headed up by Mark here in the office, is on a number of projects, some of which you may all be involved with in various facets as well. Then we have community and economic development, which Marlon heads up here as well, involved in a number of things around the state, and we're very proud of that. That's expanding almost daily. Of course, our civil engineering team, of which I'm a part of that as well. There are two additional members or team members in that group. Again, we work towards not only site schematic development, but all the way through construction documents in that leg of the business. And then again, of course, there's building forensics, which is headed up by Dan Weeks in our office. So that's just a brief overview. And Leslie, if you want to jump in there and kind of expound upon your side of our team as we work, that would be great.
Sure. So thanks. It's great to see everybody, and I appreciate the Veridus Group, and they're putting together this lockdown webinar series. I think it's been a great way to stay connected and also keep current on what's happening in the market. From Genovis's standpoint, we really have 4 buckets of service. Our group has been around now for 18 years, and we work with corporate clients to help them navigate the process of site selection and economic development advisory services. So often we are partnering with folks like the Veridus Group from an engineering perspective. We don't necessarily have that technical expertise, yet our clients need to have partners as they're evaluating locations to mitigate their risk and also enhance speed to market. So our team really, we work with corporate clients throughout the U.S. We help them with location modeling, site selection, incentive procurement, and the compliance management that goes along with that incentive procurement. So that's who we are and what it is we do.
Thank you. Well, just real quick, as you see there, is just a brief outline, bullet point, if you will, of our topic today, some of the areas that we'll be talking through. And again, we'll expound on most of this. We'll also keep an eye on time just to make sure that, that we don't run beyond. And if there's anything specific, again, as we go through this, there's any specific questions or comments that you would like us to expound upon, we can certainly do that at the end. But as we look at sites for due diligence selection and development. Obviously, one of the major components of that is the first topic there, identifying the use. And that's literally from the client team or the development team to say, okay, literally what is the use? What are we going to be building? Is it a manufacturing data center, restaurant, multifamily, residential? What is that use? And that's of course very important as we evaluate properties. Then the second topic there, the site characteristics and requirements. We really delve into all the due diligence in that leg to expound upon the geographic site location, analysis of the site and conditions, mapping, and then of course existing structures, utilities, etc. However, the site and building infrastructure will really go further into site utilities. For instance, again, every type of use has a very specific requirement as far as those utilities of water, gas, electric, data, etc. So that's where we really try to dig into, analyze not only what's there as far as physically, if it's water or gas or electric, but what's the capacity and size. So we'll expound upon that. And then obviously the last topic there is knowing the zoning and ordinance requirements. That's really important as you're looking at a site to say, okay, I'm going to build a basketball arena. Does that fit within the zoning of that site, or are there additional steps that are going to be required to really go through that? And we'll get into detail there. So with that, the first topic again, identifying your site. When getting started with this, we really encourage a very detailed look at program development. If you're going to say that I need to locate a site for a use, you need to be certainly very familiar with what that use is and how that use is going to be positioned on the site. So programming is very important. It's just as important as figuring out the details and the finishes of the building. Because if the program doesn't work and the site doesn't work, there of course won't go together. In building programming, some of the just real minimum requirements that need to be determined is obviously key team members. I think, Leslie, obviously you have comment to that, and then not only looking at that, but really what is going to be required for you to operate. When I say you, the developer or the end user. So looking at whether it's industry requirements, clients, sales, frontage, visibility, road infrastructure, on-site circulation, all of that really goes into programming a site.
Yeah, and I think I would just add from the Genovis perspective, what we try to do is counsel our clients to make sure that all of the key team members are brought into the process early in the stage, so that if there are specific requirements, that those have the opportunity to be vetted sooner in the process than later in the process. And we've worked on projects where there have been some pitfalls because folks that maybe had a key role in automating a facility weren't brought in early enough, and because of that, maybe there were ceiling height requirements or floor load capacities that weren't contemplated early stage.
Exactly. So as that's set up as a program, it's important to literally look through that and evaluate if the site will work. One thing we encourage is starting this process of site selection is to start at sort of a high level and identifying a criteria along with that program that's going to be best suited for whether it's a 10-acre site, a 40-acre site, et cetera. But really starting at a high level and working down through that criteria to make sure that you're really identifying appropriate regions and parcels for the initial selection. With that, when you start, again, focusing in on properties, another thing to be very cognizant of is who is going to be accessing or visiting the site. When you're considering site selection, it's critical to identify those individuals, whether it's the employees physically working there, whether it's shipping and delivery, clients and sales, et cetera. And with that, if that is a true retail sort of use, then obviously frontage, visibility, and roadway infrastructure is important, as well as, of course, on-site circulation. So once you're able to get to that site, you've got to determine if there's sufficient room to really mobilize, if you will, around the property. So that all comes as a part of that process in doing the development schematics to look at site selection.
And I guess what I would add there, oftentimes when we're working with our clients, they have particular drivers for their project. By example, right now we are working on a headquarters project, headquarters potential relocation. And the reason for that location is because they don't have the ability to tap into the senior level employee that they need to. So oftentimes as we are reviewing potential locations, we're also querying data to ensure that the labor market that parcel is within is going to support the type of activity that is needed, or the driver for our client. Access and visibility, proximity to infrastructure, airports, all of those things are driving factors in projects that we see. Most recently, the key driver has been the employment and the workforce.
Right. Great point. Infrastructure and utility service programming, again, as looking at the needs of a use. Mechanical and utility requirements are obviously paramount. Identifying both requirements from the sense of the structure's infrastructure, but what is the use again, or what's the output? As we evaluate sites, this capacity question is one that is typically at the forefront to say, okay, we've identified the utilities that are there, but not only those, what's their capacity? Whether it's a 4-inch water line or a 12-inch main water line, all of those are important to look at to be able to determine if a site's viable. We are working with a data center client currently together where obviously they have a very specific use and there's multiple utilities that are required there that make that site selection fairly important, because you can't just put that anywhere, of course. Circulation and access, again, part of the structure programming. As we mentioned, visibility, shipping and delivery, loading dock, layout, lay down space, all of that's critical when looking at a parcel of ground to say, okay, if I were a shipping and delivery user, do I have enough physical space to circulate, whether it's full 53-foot trailers or what have you? Do I require lay down and docking space? So again, that'll really sway the direction of where we start to focus in on properties as well. Site characteristics, availability. As we start to look at sites, and we've started again at a high level, maybe a regional outlook, we've started to identify some properties. We really must also be able to look at their geographic location from a visibility standpoint. We also, as a part of that, will evaluate the adjacent uses. So both in the zoning and ordinance scenario, as we're evaluating a site, we know that a heavy industrial zoning is going to have a very specific, maybe sometimes even broader allowable uses rather than something that's right adjacent to a single family residential. We also, of course, look at land acquisition and the availability of the site from ownership. So whether that's private individual companies, or even as we've evaluated on some recent properties, whether sites are part of a trust or a living will. That sometimes even comes into play as we're looking at sites. Then, of course,
sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as I think about the geographic location, you know, the visibility and those physical, technical matters are important. We also, from the site selection standpoint, look at the business climate, and our clients are often have a heightened level of focus on tax environment from one jurisdiction to another. I mean, even as we look in the central Indiana region, a site in Marion County is going to look very different than a site in Hendricks County from a tax liability standpoint. So we're overlaying all of those business factors on top of the geographic location factors. And to your point on land ownership, I mean, from the site selector, the path of least resistance is always the path that we want to go. And so when we see land that has multiple ownerships or encumbered ownerships, that's often a sign that it's not going to be a speedy transaction. And often we'll keep moving down the road to look for those opportunities where sort of that site due diligence has occurred. The land ownership is either maybe at the municipal level or regional level, or has a singular owner that has a very high level of interest in transitioning the property either from a lease or a purchase standpoint.
Right, great point. So even to the point of, you know, evaluating a couple of sites, I mean, those characteristics, if you will, can come down to, just as Leslie mentioned, you've got two sites that are potentially usable. One has single source ownership or single individual, whether that's company or person. Another one's tied up in a you know, a conglomeration of ownership, and certainly it can make it much easier to deal, just as you mentioned, with the single source if possible. So all those things help to criteria for establishing what's a good site. Analyzing the site as we start that process, of course, mapping and due diligence is paramount. To be able to fully understand a parcel, we really have to start to delve into the physical properties, being the physical conditions, if you will, of the site, to be able to locate suitable potential opportunities. So when we say examine both the seen and unseen, if you will, it's looking into more than, okay, when I drive by and look at it, yeah, it looks like it's 50 acres. It looks great. I can use it, but what's below the surface physically, and what's below the surface even in a zoning and ordinance requirement for that site evaluation.
So in that due diligence, you know, from an economic developer's perspective, those communities, those landowners that have done that mapping and understand what the conditions of the site are, again, it's all about risk mitigation and speed to market. So it puts that site ahead of others in terms of the site selection process.
Mm-hmm. We know more and more as development sprawl continues and what have you, there's going to be consideration for existing sites, whether it's a green site, if you will, or an adaptive reuse. Again, and more a green site doesn't necessarily mean it's a clean slate, but if there is availability for that, it certainly can make it a more cost effective, can certainly improve schedule and what have you, rather than considering adaptive reuse. However, sometimes there are issues where a client has a need for a location that's very specific. So if there are existing conditions, those have to be taken into consideration. So as we look at GIS mapping, as well as others, we'll start to bring that level of detail down to be able to focus in on certain characteristics. But as we deal with existing properties that are either built out or we're going to require some demolition or adaptive reuse, Things that have to be considered, of course, are testing, you know, whether there's a condition of the site that's going to require abatement, whether that's physically the site itself or the building use as well. I know Dan in our office does a tremendous amount of building inspection, and that's certainly going to be important as you look at, okay, taking an existing structure and making a new use from it. And then, of course, demolition procedures, knowing the budget and the schedule. That's oftentimes a pitfall, if you will, to say, okay, well, there's a simple building there. It really won't be much to take it down. But then a client needs to become fully aware of, you know, how much procedure and schedule, as well as dollars, does it take to do that. So those are all important as we look at existing structures.
I would just add as a side note, there's a thought that the pandemic and a number of businesses, unfortunately, may go out, and thus there may be an increased inventory of existing buildings. And so this adaptive reuse moving forward past COVID, I think will be ever more important.
Exactly. So inventory is probably going to increase in essence.
Right.
Just a couple of images here just to start to talk through as we get into the mapping and how we start to look at a site. This is an interchange many of you may be familiar with, but not only do we start with, okay, what's the condition of the site today, represented by a Google Earth image. Again, this is the intersection of 70 and 465. You can see at the lower southwest corner there's development in process as of the date of this image. But then oftentimes it's important to go back and say, okay, if there was a prior structure there or there wasn't, what's the likelihood of us exposing or finding something, so to speak, as we start to develop that site. So over here you can see on the right is just a copy of the Marion County GIS. I think this might have been a 2009 image, but you can see as we start to evaluate the site to say, okay, prior to at least 2009, that was a clear site with the exception of vegetation. We can see that developments continued obviously around that site. So all those are all things that we start to take into consideration as we look at an opportunity. And this is just simply an image representation. This isn't a specific project that we're working on, but just to show you that, you know, many things are critical. Site circulation, site positioning, prior site development, et cetera. All that's the information that we try to gather in that due diligence to refine whether that is a suitable site. Access, as we mentioned, you know, how many times have you been traveling down a highway and maybe some unfamiliar territory, you see some place, whether it's a restaurant or somewhere, something that you want to visit, and you say to yourself, well, how do I get there? It's not obvious how you get there. So site access is pretty typical, a requirement for many uses. However, there are some uses that are very specific, maybe only to a business owner themselves, so they're not so concerned about that. But as a part of programming for a site, you have to identify the why and in essence, who will access the site, and then know how to determine whether you've got primary routes that'll accept that for, again, shipping, receiving, sales, clients, et cetera. So some of the tools there that we utilize is in essence DOT and railroad mapping, just to identify what access is available. And then as we get into site characteristics, we start again with sort of the unseen, working again from a high level. We'll utilize GIS mapping to be able to gather significant information for the site to determine if further review is warranted. GIS, as you can imagine, is not consistent. There is some organization in the state that's trying to standardize that information. but whether you're dealing with Marion County or Hamilton County or Jackson County, I mean, all those counties typically have their own GIS. There are a few that share that service. But when you look around at opportunities like that, you're not always going to be able to get the same information for each site. So typically the goal in GIS mapping is obviously to obtain ownership. That's very consistent. Typically look at zoning, topography, land use, and adjacent uses. But I can tell you, as Leslie and I experience fairly routinely, there's not always zoning information. There's not always topographic information. So again, that just forces you back up to sort of a high level of review. As we continue on with looking at mapping, FEMA flood zone mapping and hydrology mapping, along with the topography, if available, are two tools that we use pretty routinely. Again, we'll start to identify if there's, of course, flood hazards and flood zones, which can make a site, of course, unusable, or at least portions thereof. We'll also start to gather information to determine if there's potentially wetland studies. We have another project that we're working on currently where a portion of that site was identified as potential wetland. And then a further study was done that identified the limits of that wetland and just confirmed sort of the initial findings, if you will. That particular site certainly allowed further development. It was only a portion, but as you're into instances like that, it's critical to know that up front in case there's mitigation or any work that needs to take place to develop the site. And then, of course, we look at sites in both topography and the hydro maps to be able to determine kind of an initial thought on drainage, because that's important. Just a couple examples of, for instance, Fema mapping. You can see what's presented as we looked at the site to see, okay, what are floodways? This one's fairly obvious. This site, which you may or may not be familiar with, is actually the Newfield site, but there's considerable identified areas for what can be flood zones. And as we look to develop, if this were a raw site, we would identify that as obviously, if it's, let's say 100 acres and a portion of that's in flood zone, we start to bring in the net value of what's developable. Same with the hydrologic mapping. This simply just helps us to identify whether there's either legal drains or legal outsourcing for stormwater management. So if we develop a site, we know that there's somewhere to take the water, in essence. So those are all tools that we start to use to kind of hone in on the detail of the criteria. Then, of course, soils mapping, we use that as well to identify, again, the typical soils, if you will, for just an overview of what could be compactability conditions, bearing capacity, and then, of course, permeability for drainage. So those are, again, just part of the mapping tools that are used to fine-tune a site selection. And then from there, of course, usually in development, if that site were to progress, then of course soils borings can be typically performed as a part of the development to fully determine the conditions. Site and building infrastructure, again, reviewing the program, considering the requirements of the use as related to the utility infrastructure that's available. As I mentioned, we'll perform, when available, utility mapping. And that is a question mark because, again, with varying municipalities or regions, that information's not always, I should say, readily available. To the instance of where you're dealing with maybe Vectron, who will provide a detailed map of, okay, here's where our lines are, sizes and capacities, to local government or local utility where it's in essence, well, we put it in 10, 15 years ago, we didn't really keep a plan or a map, then it can become challenging to really source that information. So that's something that we work with pretty diligently, and we'll often go back and even reevaluate as the site progresses. Leslie, am I skimming over anything there that you might want to add?
You're doing great. I just keep thinking, yes, these things are also critically important, you know, as we are rolling up to look at sites. So again, to the extent communities and landowners are able to do this and have this information readily available, will help clients make decisions with respect to locations.
Exactly. Just a couple of graphic representations of sort of the mapping that's used. For instance, I mentioned here's a water utility mapping for a site, I believe, Davies County, that really shows basically an overview legend of what's available, both in structures and piping. And then, as I mentioned, here on the right is a vector and gas utility map. You can see very clearly, with the exception of detailed parcel lines, you know, this map illustrates both mainline size and then lateral size of their infrastructure. So those are tools that, when they're available, they're a great help, in essence, to be able to build a library, so to speak, for site analysis, as you're just diving in deeper to determine if a site is usable. Zoning and ordinance requirements. This is again a level of the detail that's just developed as we're looking at sites. So again, you can start with all the first parameters to say the circulation works, the property works, it's in the area that I want to utilize, and say, okay, that's a site I want to purchase and develop. If you don't go far enough to check zoning and ordinance information, again, you can run down a rabbit hole, so to speak, and then find yourself stuck with a piece of ground that doesn't work. So it's really important to go through that and identify, number one, who are the authorities having jurisdiction. Typically that can be, you know, local, county, state, et cetera, and start to evaluate what their requirements are. Of course, you've got to identify what the zoning is currently, and then see if your use fits within that. Of course, we all know that there is potential variance that can be done for whether it's a use or development standards. Variances in almost all instances are open for submittal, but they're certainly not guaranteed. So a lot of times working with a client to understand the fact that, okay, this site could work if we could attain a variance, it's important to know what the cost and schedule ramifications of performing a variance request is. Again, just as I mentioned, the detailed review of local guidelines and requirements for development certainly must be performed as part of the evaluation process. When we look at ordinance requirements of a site, we'll start to identify setbacks, buffers, and green spaces that are required, even to the extent of parking requirements. So those will vary based on use, of course. And then, as I mentioned, drainage requirements. That's one that's often overlooked, to say, okay, how am I going to handle stormwater? Is it going to be a pond, whether it be a wet pond or a dry pond? And then what's the ordinance requirements in the local authority to allow me to develop that? So all those things take up a developable footprint within a site. And a lot of times that's easily overlooked, to say, well, I'm going to have a half-acre pond on my site that I didn't consider. That just means less building, less parking, less use, so to speak. Ordinance requirements, again, going just that far enough into detail to identify, okay, we have a use, but we also need to look at what the ordinance allows, whether it's building height, building facade and materials, the mechanicals, et cetera, accessory structures, dumpsters, et cetera. All those are important items to consider up front or as early as possible to ensure a site's gonna work for the end use. really we see that a lot. I mean, local jurisdiction will have, specifically in overlay districts or special districts, they'll have requirements that'll, whether they be of a facade or a two-story building, et cetera, that a client, you know, may not take into consideration. Just an example of that is I was part of a Masonry Council's award meeting, probably 2006 timeframe, I believe. And there was a local restaurateur who had developed a site in Carmel, who was receiving an award from the Masonry Council for basically such a beautiful building. Of course, the architect were there, and himself, the business owner, was there. And as they got up and accepted the award, literally in that presentation, the business owner said, well, you know, I've got to thank Carmel for the requirement of such a nice building, because quite frankly, I wouldn't have gone to that extent if it were left to me. So that's all cost of development, and all of those things need to be considered up front to see what the requirements are, just as an example.
I'm just going to pop in here, you know, on the building height issue. We work with a cold storage facility developer and user for facilities throughout the US. And we've worked on that relationship since about 2007. And when we first started working with them, their building height requirements were maybe 60 feet. And then it eked up to an 80 foot, and now it's 100 foot. And so what we're finding is a lot of those zoning and ordinance requirements don't necessarily allow for such large, such high buildings, and going to communities that allow for those variance requests and modifications has become a very important aspect of our site selection process.
Exactly. As a sort of a final stage, if you will, of the certification process, working through this, very typically as we work with Genovis, a part of this will be a simple schematic or site plan study. Basically, what that does is takes all the information that we've gathered as a part of due diligence, whether it be, you know, soils, ordinance requirements, zoning, et cetera, and then says, okay, here's all my parameters. Given all the information known, what is the potential developable portion of a site? I can tell you in almost all instances, it's less than the gross acreage, if you will, of a property. So as you're working with an end user to say, okay, it may be 100 acres. Once I put all these pieces into place, being not only your own requirements for the building, circulation, et cetera, but as well as local requirements, here's what you're sort of left with. Now, that's typically done in a pretty schematic instance to say, okay, here's what it could look like. But in all cases, you want to tend to maximize that space to be able to say, okay, if I were to purchase it and not even build it all today, how much could I grow? A lot of times the business will certainly evaluate that for future development to say whether it's my own business or tenant lease space, how much building footprint can I put on a parcel? So that's pretty important to start to look at it as you tailor into this final phase.
Yeah, having a picture is worth 1,000 words, and we find that having a preliminary site plan, even if it doesn't ideally fit the end user, it's a great starting point and opportunity to start tweaking based on their specifications. Definitely a value add.
Right. Again, just all those steps are working toward the end result to try to ensure success for a project. Obviously, that's the goal, and performing due diligence is just the initial phase of looking at a site for development. There's much more, obviously, that follows after that, but that first step is just as critical as picking out the door hardware for the inside. So with that, we certainly appreciate your involvement today and would entertain any questions or comments that you may have.
I really
Here's one.
appreciate
Oh,
the
go ahead.
presentation. I'd never seen one from that perspective. So thanks for inviting me, Leslie. I've just been hearing little rumors. You know, everyone I think wants to know what you're seeing with the dollars out there. Would you say that the public dollars are going to be more drying up and we're going to go into a shift of more private dollars for what you're doing? That's towards Scott, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. There's the incentive hat too, so I can comment on that as well.
Just meaning like the activity of what do you see now? I mean, I believe the first 2 months, everybody was in shock and in a fog. And from what I've read, only 15% of companies are even moving forward as normal. So that means 85% are kind of, you know, halfway or stalled. But what are you seeing in terms of forecast, you know, like the next month and even the last month? You know, what have you seen in terms of new development coming? Would you say that the private dollars are going to start to back down? And, or, you know, what is your shift? What do you see coming?
Sure. Well, and one thing, I'm not sure if he's still on here. I'd love for Tim Jensen, the principal of Veridus, to kind of jump in and maybe certainly add to that, or even Marlon. I can tell you that's something in the construction and design industry, that's what we try to look at all the time. Nobody has a crystal ball, and I can tell you it's very cloudy if you did right now anyway. Just given the constraints and even the position of sort of coming out of the COVID situation, I think the next 6, 9, maybe 18 months are going to be kind of unsure footing for a lot of people. I can tell you that we have seen cost increases from a construction and material supply instance increase, whether that's starting at the front end yet from land acquisition to development. I think maybe Leslie, you might comment on that, but
Yeah.
I think all in all, I'm just going to echo your own point to say it's an unsure time. And I think being wise about a lot of different things is going to be critical.
It's interesting. Research recently done by the Site Selectors Guild, which is, you know, a group of site selectors throughout the country. I think there's 53 of them. They were just queried about the economic conditions and were evenly split in terms of projects moving forward and those being put on hold. Yeah, so that was interesting. From our company perspective, 90% of what we were working on has continued to move forward, and those projects that have been put on hold have been put on hold versus being completely terminated. On the money side of the equation, we have seen states, regions, local communities start to reallocate some of the funding. By example, we've had some projects that were allocated infrastructure funding to support their projects, and the state has come and said, is this project really moving forward? We might want to redeploy those funds in other areas just because of the severe hit that the, you know, tax revenue is taking. And so we are definitely seeing that from public sector economic development agencies in terms of looking for opportunities to read, meaning less opportunities for dollars to go into some of those projects, which you know, I think is a slippery slope, because you know, you want private development to continue, and sometimes in order for that private development to continue, there needs to be some public support. And so I hate to see that public support being pulled completely, because there will be an end to this, and those projects need to continue on their development path, because that's what's going to result in jobs. So it's sort of an interesting dynamic right now, and more to come for sure. But there seems to be a level of optimism.
There does.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Leslie, this is a little bit of a piggyback off of what you were just saying. I was just on a call earlier with somebody who was asking me if I've seen economic development groups kind of pay towards some of the site due diligence, if I ever see that. Like in my experience, I haven't. Do you see that throughout, you know, Indiana and the Midwest, different entities paying part of it to lure that particular company in?
Absolutely. And I would say that the way they're paying for that oftentimes is in conducting the due diligence, the site readiness. I mean, that's an expense oftentimes that a company would have to undertake. And so to the extent that the community gets out ahead of that and has the topo maps and the wetland study and understands what the soil conditions are and has done a 2D layout, communities paid for that. That's that due diligence. Not that the company, depending upon the use, is going to rely on that solely, but it does take some of that preliminary expense, eliminate some of that preliminary expense. Yeah, I say the smart communities are those that are preparing in that manner, that have that vision and that commitment to undertake some of that initial cost.
You see that a lot in Indiana, smart communities?
We do. There are some communities that are smarter than others, Brandy, but we do. And I think there's a lot of communities that understand that in order to remain competitive, it's not competitive just for attracting new businesses, but it's also competitive for keeping your existing businesses. You know, what happens when a business grows and you don't have a parcel of land or a building that can accommodate their growth? They're going to move to the next community. So those communities that are being aggressive in their site preparedness are those that are going to prevail.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yep. We can chat more about that if you'd like to, if you want to know those communities that are being diligent in that way. Other questions?
Any other questions or? Here's one question that popped in just real quick, and I'll just kind of read it out for maybe discussion. But was questioned, how should I proceed on a project where a community doesn't have a zoning ordinance? You've seen that in an issue on one particular client, and that can make it challenging again. But when there are communities that maybe don't have zoning rules, don't have zoning regulations in place, it's literally working through an optimum of whether you set it up, and I don't want to use the term of PUD or private unit development, but maybe set up guidelines and help a community to refine ordinances and establish guidelines for development. And again, that's just as Leslie was talking about in sort of forward-thinking communities. That's kind of important to be able to make parcels marketable, in essence, to bring business in. So, of course, there's any number of ways to go about that, but it is a step that can be a little bit more challenging to work with.
Well, and I think from our perspective, those communities that don't have zoning in place, it's a gamble. You
Exactly.
know, if you've got a company, and particularly an institutional level company, and they're committing significant dollars to a new facility, the last thing they want to is to invest a significant amount and then have something very contrary built next door to them. So oftentimes we will keep moving if there is no zoning guidelines, if there are no zoning guidelines in place.
Just another quick question here was, if certain site condition maps are not available, how should I go about retrieving that information? And I can assume that probably meant when we were talking specific about topography and even zoning information. You know, a part of the due diligence, even when zoning is identified on a GIS through a local municipality or county or what have you, we'll still go far enough to confirm that, if you will. Sometimes the GIS can be kind of broadband to say, okay, this entire area is, whether it's whatever, agricultural or residential one or what have you. We'll certainly then go deeper and contact local planning to verify that, because you can't quite always trust the zoning as identified on GIS. The topography information, again, there's other mapping that's available to be able to get kind of a broad sense of a topography. One thing to point out, any of the GIS topography is typically, you know, within plus or minus 2 to 5 feet potentially. So the best case scenario, of course, is a topography study or a topo survey, which can be performed, which would be at a little bit deeper level to say, okay, the site's matching all my other requirements. I want to go far forward to see how I might fully develop it, and then I would just simply perform a topo survey.
I'm curious for the folks that are on the phone, any unique trends that you're seeing with respect to, I guess, project activity, or yeah, just any interesting observations on your end that you want to share with the group?
I have one, Leslie, if you don't mind me jumping in here.
Is that Tim?
It is.
Yes.
Yeah, of course not. Please do.
Hey, so I had a really interesting conversation this morning that I think everybody would be interested in. Talking to a developer of, they mainly function on post-acute care or assisted living, memory care type services. And it's regarding a new development they want to do out on the east side of Indianapolis. But obviously the silver tsunami is still happening and will be happening for a while, as far as that age group moving into assisted living facilities and aging in place facilities over the next 20 to 30 years is going to still be a market boon all over the country. However, what this gentleman was telling us was the changes that are coming just because of the last 8 weeks, right? And what's happening, because now, as we all know, and we've read in the papers that, and you guys, some of you may have experienced this even personally, is that, you know, the nursing homes in those areas were very hardly hit, were very badly hit by the virus. And so the conversations that are ongoing between potential users, kids putting their parents into living conditions, you know, how are they feeding people, you know, safely? If there's another virus outbreak, how are they, what is their plan? Because so many of these places were caught flat-footed on not being able to respond accordingly. And so he said they had 3 projects on the drawing board at the time when this hit. So they pulled them all off. Not that they're not going to do them, but they're going to redesign everything. So they're working with some of the leading healthcare designers to totally reframe what that assisted living and skilled nursing facility starts to look like in the future, to give assurances to families that their loved ones will be protected and cared for in a much different way than they were over this last, you know, several months. And so he said it's going to drastically change the healthcare market. And then I was actually meeting with one of the major healthcare suppliers in the area as part of this meeting. And then we got in this larger conversation about how healthcare is going to change completely top to bottom. So I think we're going to see a huge shift in the healthcare market and how they build projects. The one we were meeting with today had a hospital on the books in the next 5 years. They have scrapped that whole idea. They don't want a hospital now. They're moving away from hospitals. They're moving more towards preventative care and trying to get people never to come to their hospital, is what they told us today. So they believe they can, number one, actually have more reimbursements on the other side, but just the whole idea of the continuum of care from the very beginning to the very end. I think this virus has woken up a sleeping giant that I think there's going to be a lot of people addressing in the healthcare industry and in the long-term care industry in order to make changes that keep people comfortable and more healthy.
And Tim, I would echo that on the supply chain side. I think that, you know, all of the outsourcing of healthcare related products that has occurred over the past many decades, I think there's going to be a renewed focus to have those products manufactured closer to home and closer proximity so that we're not caught short. And I think that will be a definite trend in the healthcare life sciences arena as well. Whose call is this?
Pardon me?
We're at 3:30, Scott, so.
Are we? Yeah, it was just checking. Well, listen, really appreciate everybody being here and being involved a little bit. We'll obviously have some follow-up to this, kind of keep an eye out. Leslie, greatly appreciate our ability to be able to sort of jump in on this together, and appreciate your input and guidance as well. So if you have any follow-up questions or comments, anyone, please feel free to reach out to the team. We'd be happy to follow up with you and look forward to our future communication.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
everybody.
Thank you,
It
guys.
was great to see you. Thanks for asking for me to participate.
Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.